just to confirm, we're doing the second motion that the government should provide incentives for the urban poor to migrate to rural areas.
Yes, that's right.
And then just to confirm, finally, both teams vetoed the top motion.
Yep.
Yes.
Excellent. All right. So without any further delays, I invite the first affirmative to come up and defend the motion in their name. Actually, sorry, one final thing. Please time yourselves. I will do reactions at the 6-minute and 8-minute mark, just to give you an idea of where you're up to in your speeches. But the best thing is if you can please time yourselves and start wrapping up at around the 8-minute mark. Cool. Thank you very much. First affirmative, when you're ready.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
All right, I'll start in 5 seconds. We think that the way the growth of cities is projected right now is that there's rapid unplanned growth, especially concentrated in a few sectors and a few demographics. And we think there's a gap between that particular economic development and benefits that relay back to the urban poor. That is in terms of getting affordable housing, sanitation, healthcare, etc. We think this gap is increasing as we go on in the years, and we think moving back to the rural areas will incentivize two things: A, development in those particular rural areas, and a reduction of these problems and a development of healthcare, sanitation, etc. for these urban poor. What are incentives? And this is like our model for this particular debate. We think these incentives look like things like setting up employment in the industries present in the rural areas and giving certain people job guarantees if possible, giving them housing grants to ensure affordable housing in the particular rural areas and developing housing facilities for the same. Lastly, we'll also be willing to give further tax breaks if and when necessary to these particular people for the same jobs. We also think to the extent which we're making this policy, we're also going to be spreading information / awareness about these particular jobs and housing or life in the rural areas, the point at which these particular people from the urban poor want to migrate there. We think, just to give you an idea of the amount of people living in urban poverty, we think that in India, like a huge amount of the population lives in poverty, especially in cities. Like we think nearly 20-25% of people simply just live in poverty in the urban areas. Reasons being, like, apart from the fact that just the standard of life is so high, due to urban concentration, like standard of life, the affordability for that is extremely high too. That is, say, you need to pay a lot to go to healthcare, you need to pay a lot to just rent your house for a month. And this usually leads to the urban poor congregating in things like slums or ghettos, where there's poor sanitation, poor access to education or healthcare, and they're usually stuck in cycles of poverty. So we think this is problematic, or we think it's better that the state owes an obligation to the rural areas to develop those too. We'll explain why this is particularly the case. We think that for rural areas in general, we think there's a lot of benefits for the state in purview of this policy. Why? Because we think, one, for rural areas, they simply need more working population. Notice the types of industries are usually set up in rural areas. It's usually predominantly things like agriculture, construction, or like mainly manufacturing or for primary industries, which necessarily need an urban population. However, the trend right now is for a lot of people from rural areas to start migrating to urban areas for two key reasons. A, there's a lack of development of better standard of living in rural areas. We think we're going to fix that the point time we inject more working population, economic activity in these particular places. But two, there's simply a narrative surrounding that if you go to urban areas, you're better likely to get a job and you're more likely to get these opportunities, which is problematic because these people who end up going to these urban areas more often than not end up in being part of the urban poor and are stuck in these ghettos and cycles of poverty, which we think is problematic, and we need to break that particular thing. Two, we think that urban rural areas get better because the point when we pass this policy, there's a signaling effect which forces the government to start developing these particular rural areas because of the way these incentives are structured. If you're ensuring people jobs, you need to start developing the job sector. If you're ensuring people affordable housing, you need to start developing the housing sector. I think this essentially forces the government to start developing these rural areas, apart from the fact that it's really sending a lot of people there. Three, we think that now that these two policies are, these two things are like solidified, we think it's easier to get jobs and generate jobs for this particular people. Notice if you develop the housing sector, apart from the fact it's just easier to get jobs when there's less competition for it, we think it's going to be better jobs because there's such a there's a necessity for these things like agriculture or manufacturing to get their working population, because they need to source raw material, they need to put in the labor, they need to put in the works of hours that everyone needs to. More, but like the point time, there's a necessity, we think, to usually get these jobs. But more importantly, notice you're able to create more, better, and more affordable standard of living, especially for the urban poor, right? Notice the point time when they move to rural areas, the housing is going to be cheaper. The government will be forced to set up things like education, healthcare, and develop those things for that particular people. And we think, notice the comparative here. It's not that they're just leaving away from cities. It's that there's not that they're leaving the benefits of the cities. They don't get the access of high privileged schools or high privileged healthcare that are present in cities. What they do get, because they're urban poor, are usually living in slums and ghettos. I think comparatively, our world's better off for these individuals. We think this also leads to more efficient development of agriculture or manufacturing industries, because notice right now, because of a lack of working population and lack of development in rural areas, the point in time more people get into it, it's a prerogative of government to develop that. We think it's going to lead to more efficient ways to develop these particular industries. Fourthly, let's notice the comparative, right? We think the amount of congestion and contamination the urban poor are forced to live with in cities is abhorrent, right? Notice that due to exorbitant land pricing, which makes it likely they'll just end up in ghettos, means that certain things like disease is more prevalent, certain things like lack of education is more prevalent, and things are simply problematic. We think the problem is, and this is why we need these particular incentives, is that they're unlikely to migrate on their own. Why is this the case? Two major reasons. A, there's an information gap about lives in rural areas for people who are born into the urban poor, which makes it unlikely that they'll leave. Now, that's why we made information awareness a part of a model. But two, there's a financial gap, right? That's to say, notice the point time you're forced to live in ghettos and you can't afford housing or you can't get jobs because you don't get the education the same people in cities. And since there's so much competition due to the amount of people in the cities, it makes it extremely hard for them to get out of poverty or get enough, save up enough money to simply go out and afford the houses even in rural areas. The point in time we're giving these people incentives and job guarantees and housing grants, we think you're reducing that financial gap by a lot, which makes people more likelier to leave these particular cities in the first place. We think that's why we need this particular policy. Two, we think about why we think urban areas are just unlikely to develop further in perspective of these particular urban pools. One, we think cities simply have a limit, right? Notice there's just a simple amount of limit to which you can expand your land. Notice a simple amount of limit to where you get natural resources from nearby, right? More importantly, cities have a limit in terms of growth. In terms of growth, especially regarding the urban poor. Why is this the case? Cities focus only on a few sectors. Notice New York's known for banking, Los Angeles is known for entertainment, and they focus on these industries which cater to the middle class or upper middle class of this particular demographic, right? Notice they usually cater to the higher ends of that particular society. This results in a rapid growth, where we agree, but a rapid unplanned growth, which creates a job between that, like we highlighted earlier, between the development of facilities for the urban poor and the economic growth of those particular cities. We think the point in time this is true. We think the government owes an obligation to the urban area, the rural areas. Three reasons why. Simply, they have an obligation to rural areas. One, because every territory needs equitable opportunities. If you're maintaining territorial sovereignty over the whole country, you need to ensure everything has some equitable distribution. Two, there's a trend to go urban because of the narrative opportunities. We need to reinvest back into these rural areas. Three, we think the state tries to help our rural areas in status quo, but it simply can't because of a lack of people and lack of resources and lack of interest in that particular area. We think the point time we're pumping more people in and doing all these incentive developments, we think we're making it better for that. Lastly, we think just because of the reasons we told you about why urban areas are so bad, like ghettoization and things like that, we think it's harder for these people to escape these particular lives. And we think this is the only way to break the poverty trap. Why we justify in pursuing this policy? One, we think notice this is an incentive. That means if people desperately still want to stay in the urban areas, we still have the agency to do so. Two, we think this debate needs to be judged on development, right? The state is ultimately a utilitarian body. And we think the point in time we gave a certain obligation, why need to develop utilitarian areas, like rural areas. We think on that scale, we think we win on the utilitarian front. And for that, we think that development is better off on our side of the house. And we think the individual lives of the urban poor are better off on our side of the house. Extremely proud to propose.
I thank the first affirmative for their speech, and I invite the first negative to open the negative side of the debate.
Can you hear me? Okay. So this semester, due to COVID-19, all classes of Renmin University becomes online. and there's some girl always missing from class, and I don't know why. And so I asked them. They told me that because of they have no internet connection infrastructure or poor infrastructure in rural areas, that they cannot connect to internet or anything 4G, so they cannot even attend the class. So when we talk about incentives, government don't tell you about those internet connection failures, about those industry change and employment adjustments. They depict a utopia of a beautiful country rural side where there's cheap house, there's like abundant job markets. So first we need to talk about what those incentives look like, right? The government talk about like policy of housing, of employment, like because the government, if you want to incentivize people to urban poor to migrate, they're more likely to like raise some propaganda in the media or in some slogan to tell you that how beautiful rural area is and how like the job market is vacant for you and you need to move from like urban areas to rural areas to have a better life, to have a better like promising futures. And however, they don't tell you that like the internet connection failure I mentioned in the at the first of my speech, and they also don't tell you about how you can like the industry of rural areas is very different from city areas, and they don't tell you about there's less information, less resources that you can get in urban areas. So when we talk about urban poor, we need to know that what kind of people they are. That these kind of people are likely to grow up in city. They're familiar with like the environment they are living in. They have friends there. They know how to meet the market in those urban areas because all their vocational skills are cultivated and raised up and like raised for the purpose of serving the division of labor in urban areas, which is highly highly developed division of labor. And they also like because they grow up in these cities, they have the sense of feeling of belonging here. But when they look at those propaganda, how this like a wonderful like paradise life in rural areas, like so they move to rural areas and without knowing those like underserviced difficulties, and then they kind of like feel frustrated, feel like why is that so? Because all their vocational skills are like cultivated for the purpose of like urban market, and when they get to rural areas, they don't know like how to like they have more difficulty in than rural residents who live up who grow up in rural areas about how they can uh they don't know how to like to fit into the rural areas, and they feel a sense of like loss because they leave their intimate friends, they leave their like intimate environment to seek a better future in rural areas. However, what they look at is like internet connection failures, and they find competition for rural with rural residents, because if rural residents want to move to the urban, that they are regarded as the urban poor, right? So rural residents were more likely to stay in the like rural area residents still live like still residents in their areas, and they compete with the urban poor that is moving to this to their village and their towns. And those urban poors, when they face this kind of difficulties that is not say in the propaganda, and they won't go back because the opportunity of them going back is it costs a lot, because it costs and because they suffer like in urban areas, so their self-esteem is like hurt, and next time when they find they in rural areas all this difficulty, all those employments, they find that they feel like scared to change, and they feel like incompetent to their future. And about government, because the next step of incentivizing to move to urban areas, to urban poor, to rural areas, is that they need to develop, whether it is rural areas or urban areas. And policy of government is about priority, right? There's the government need to decide, after, even if those urban poor move to rural areas, the government need to decide the choices: A, to improve the urban, and B, to build the infrastructure of rural areas, which is more likely to cost a lot of money, because they are start from scratch, and they need more time to set up all the infrastructure, all the job market for those urban poor that have moved to the rural areas. And when you compare the choice A and the choice A and choice B, the government, of course, is that if you invest 1 million in the city, and you can receive 1 billion in a 5 year, and you in choice B, you invest 1 billion, and you can only receive 1 million a profit in a decade. So the government will more likely to put more resources after the urban poor clear out their space in the city, and the government will focus on their work on how to attract more money, abroad, elites and those intellectuals, to fill up the space that urban poor leave for them. And they because they can invest less, and they can receive more benefits. So in this situation, that the urban will have more development, and those urban poor who live who migrate to rural areas, they will have less attention from the policy, from the government, because government would like to prioritize the development of urban, instead of building those infrastructure of rural areas from zero. And this depicts a clear picture of polarization of city and rural areas, and whereas urban poor will become rural poor, and the poor residents also have more difficulty in to climb up the social ladder, which my partner will further explain to you prior to a post.
I thank the first negative for their speech, and I invite the second affirmative to continue the affirmative side of the debate.
Hi, am I audible and visible?
Yep.
All right, cool. Just give me a second, sorry. All right. I want to make one observation before I start off my speech, right? The thing is that we don't think that negative have essentially engaged with the idea that all the benefits that come from urban areas and urbanization don't track back to the urban poor. So insofar as they say, insofar as they make claims that somehow rural areas are necessarily worse or whatever, they need to make it on a comparative and tell us why urban areas are necessarily better. We got no engagement on that front whatsoever. Okay, I'm going to talk about two things in this speech, right? I'm going to talk about existing narratives around cities and why this is required to counterbalance that, and why this will actually lead to that kind of development. Secondly, I'm going to talk about development in cities and add some more layers of analysis as to why those things don't track back to the urban poor, right? Before that, I'm going to respond to broadly the three things that they've talked about, right? The first thing that they say, so there's poor infrastructure in rural areas, and that's bad, right? Firstly, we said that's the point as to why we ought to develop, right? Because we think state owes obligations to those areas as well, to those people as well, right? We think given the fact there's a lot of migration going from rural areas to urban areas because of the narrative around cities, because the fact that people perceive there to be more opportunities and things like that, means that often these rural areas go neglected, right? What the point here is to ensure and to create a clear signaling mechanism, both in terms of like making sure that people actually reach the rural areas, but also signaling to other, like say industries and things like that like, look, we're giving labor, we're providing labor there, so these industries will develop, right? I think that's what we're talking about on our side of the house, and that's exactly why we get better infrastructure, and that's the point, right? Secondly, it's a choice, right? It's still unclear as to why it's not, right? They talk about government propaganda. I'll deal with it in my second point, but like I just want to point out, like none of the analysis is particularly convincing. It's still a choice that you have to do, and it's trade-off you have to weigh, right? But third thing to say is that like in terms of poor infrastructure, right? They talk about internet connection, right? How likely is it that the urban poor gets that internet connection as good anyway, right? It's still unclear what the comparative is. We say that urban poor are cut off from the access points to urbanization purely like for a lot of reasons, right? Firstly, like a lot of these things are really expensive in those areas, meaning that they don't have access to it. And secondly, they like cities tend to cater to the middle class, upper middle class, and things like that. Thirdly, political incentives within the cities as to like local elections, local mayors, things like that often cater again to those people who are like upper class and rich, which means these services again don't necessarily track back to these urban poor, right? Which means that like it's unclear what the comparative is on that point, right? Secondly, they say that the government would propagandize rural areas, right? I have a lot of responses, right? Firstly, they prove no amount of likelihood as to like why this is going to happen, right? Why is the state going to like necessarily propagandize and say this is like some sort of rural paradise or whatever, right? We told you clearly that we support and we think the states should do things where they have clear like informational pathways to individuals, right? It's unclear why states would do this in like literally the worst way that happens. But even if like that somehow happens, I have a few responses, right? Firstly, there are media mechanisms to critique that, right? Insofar as the state is like pulling like wild propaganda as to like what these things look like, we think media can easily come and critique it. And this is as a point of state policy, something that's is likely to make people care and make people look up and care and think that like, look, the state is doing something wrong, right? And secondly, insofar as like these media mechanisms work, we think it's particularly effective in sort of critiquing what rural areas look like, right? Because the narrative around rural areas aren't like nobody really talks about rural areas. So insofar as you're the dark media house that gets the story about how there's this scandal going on where the government is like bigging up rural areas and things like that, you control the narrative around what new rural areas are perceived. So these media mechanisms and the criticisms that come from that are likely to be uniquely effective in actually effectuating change, making sure that the government doesn't do the kind of wild propaganda that they're talking about, right? The third thing is that other people who enter into these programs will obviously be able to like tell the urban poor, right? Obviously, the urban poor has to have friends who are probably likely to be back in the cities and things like that. And insofar as this program is like so terrible, they're likely to go tell them that like, look, it's bad, don't do this, right? And fourthly, we say that we just don't think that like people are like that stupid that they fall for like that kind of blatant propaganda. They give them no likelihood analysis as to why these people are like they're poor, but obviously they're not stupid, right? We think they make these rational decisions based on their particular current situations and what they expect there, right? We don't think that they believe in the state, especially given the fact that they said poor people, they already have some sort of like a cautious approach towards the state, given the state is to an extent failed them, right? Which means it's unlikely that they're going to buy the kind of wholesale propaganda that like Negative are talking about. But and finally, in the worst case, they can still go back, right? Like I don't understand why some sense of self-esteem is the harm here, right? In the worst case, they can still try and move back, but we don't think that's ever going to come down to that for all the reasons that I told you, right? Oh yeah, one more final thing is that like there's already existing propaganda on cities in that people perceive cities to be the land of opportunities. That simply isn't the case. So insofar as we're doing this is actually something to counterbalance the existing propaganda around cities. That's a good thing anyway, right? Finally, the third thing that they talk about is that like, look, the government will prioritize urban areas as a whole, and that's bad. Right? Firstly, again, there's really no likelihood analysis as to why it's the case that government will now suddenly prioritize urban areas. But secondly, we're telling you clear mechanisms. Right? What did we tell you? We told you first, we're going to provide them things like job. We want the state to provide them things like job guarantees, housing grants, and things like that to ensure that they can actually go there and find an affordable and sustainable way of living. But secondly, it's a clear signaling effect, right? Saying that the state wants to develop this, right? A few things follow from this, right? Firstly, we want the state to follow this up with like actual building schools and hospitals. But secondly, like other private players will also follow this up. So industries like agriculture and manufacturing will invest more into that because they realize that this is a labor influx coming in there, which means more money goes into there, more people can work there, and more employment is provided as a whole, right? That signaling effect is something they need to necessarily tackle on their side of the house, right? Okay, so firstly, on the existing narratives around cities, right? Understand that people perceive cities to be some sort of land of opportunities where if you go there, you get everything that you want, right? That in reality doesn't happen for the vast majority of people who actually move to cities, right? This is an important counter narrative to that, to say that like, look, like given that people perceive that and people stay in cities regardless of how bad the situation is, given that there's a fact, there's a poverty trap that we talked about, we think this incentive is the only thing to kind of break that existing narrative, but there seems to be a unidirectional migration that continues to move from rural areas to cities, wherein like these people don't actually get the employment opportunities, but often in many cases in many countries around the world, the cities have become saturated, where like often the cities are going to their limits, where a lot of cities around the world, for instance, don't know where their water supply is going to come in the next few years. They don't know they don't know how supply chains are going to be built to feed and house so many people. In that context in which we're debating, we think it's particularly important to move these people, to give incentives for these people to move to rural areas so that they can actually live more fulfilling lives, so that cities don't get like stretched to the limit, and that the existing propaganda on cities and how they're how they're supposed to be the place where you get employment gets broken, right? That's uniquely effective, right? Secondly, like development in cities don't really track back to the poor, right? And this is largely engaging with the case, something that they like literally never responded to, right? Like if you're really poor within these cities, you're likely to fall into a poverty trap where you can't access things like healthcare and education, where you often have to work in a minimum wage, a dead-end minimum wage job where you don't have any opportunity of growth and things like that, right? This poverty trap means that you're unlikely to ever access the things the cities, like the things that the comparative advantages cities actually have for you to actually have the better quality of life. This combined with the cost of living, the high cost of living in cities, means that it's way more likely that like life in the rural areas is probably going to be better off for you. But the problem is that you don't know that, and there's an information asymmetry, there's a financial problem, there's a problem of financial security where you're not sure whether you want to move. And thirdly, there's an immense amount of propaganda around cities. Unfortunately, there's just not enough development because of the fact that like factories and like agriculture believe that the direction of movement is rural to urban, which means like, for instance, like countries tend to like import their goods and things like that rather than like try to produce it on their own. We change all of that, right? And even above and beyond all of those benefits, it's the fact that states owe obligations to their rural populations who are becoming poorer because of these migrations from rural areas to cities, which means that we think development within these areas should be particularly prioritized. Incredibly proud to affirm.
Thank you. Am I audible now?
Yes, you are.
And also, like, because during the previous round there was some tech problem going on with my laptop, so like please remind me anytime if you lose me or anything. Thank you.
Yep, will do. If you drop out, I will stop the timer and we'll make sure you're back and all of that.
Okay, thank you very much
for letting us know.
Okay, so thanks for that speech. I think like the strongest point coming from the other side is that the urban poor's life in the city is actually a really, really terrible life. However, let's not get this wrong. Like even if we think that currently, like due to the economic judgments, there is like absolutely bad things. However, there's still upsides about the life uniquely that can only be acquired in the city. That's why the people choose to keep staying in the city rather than, for example, go back to their hometown or move to in a smaller city and then into the country to seek some easy job. We see that the unique chances of education, of medication, of like this social network through the process of, for example, the urban poor future generation going into the local school or whatsoever, and also because of the information flow that's uniquely acquired on like with so many media and so many industry possible standing in that city, that becomes possible for if probably not the urban poor themselves, but for the next generation. I think that's the reason they choose to stay in this kind of situation. However, I do recognize they say there were some good sides, that use some like good pictures probably happening in the rural area. However, when we look into the nature of these incentives that's provided by the government, we must see the government will never cover like the potential risk when they're trying to set up these policies and even giving out direct economic rewards. We think that first, it means that when these urban poor, even if by their own wish make the choice of opting in the rural life, it means they're harder to go back to their older life, even if they found the new life unsatisfying. And furthermore, we think it means that even if that is like these group of people who actively make the choice to go to the rural place, there will still be these people who remain in their urban area. And we think the worst thing from their side is that for these remaining group, they lose all the possibility, that is to say the number and the political capital that they generate only by the means of like number of being left in this situation for so long, just as what they said, because we think there are still media and check and balances and all these things exist. That's why only when like these incentives for these poor not to move to rural area don't exist, that these political capital can turn into more direct aid towards the improvement of their life on city. So two things I'm gonna do. First, I'm gonna elaborate and tell you what the real process of these structural adjustments following their policy look like, rather than give you reason why their depiction of the new setup of the entire ecosystem in the rural area will be wrong. And secondly, I'm going to give you two alternatives that we have without this policy, without this preference, that why it's more likely that we get better, urban poor and the entire urban rural structure development get better on our side. So onto the first point, let's look at what this process was going to be like. They said they make it sound like there's going to be unlimited welfare within the rural area, but I would very like to hear the answer from probably the third speaker, how this is going to happen. Like what kind of industry you want to put up there in the rural area, what kind of job training, who will provide this job training towards these new urban migrants, given that they were not or even provided to the rural residents themselves. We think that the fact that the building up of industry, the building up of education, and the attraction of talents that is enough to teach students, that's enough to conduct medical surgery, that's enough to set up this new industry and understand how they actually works, ask much more than only money, but also the entire ecosystem that's far beyond their policy. For example, they just move in dozens of people, labor force that does not construct an entire new industry and new development, as they easily pointed out. We think the difficulty for rural area development currently is that they were unable to attract new capital and new techniques that really works from point to bring something into that area. We think at this point, blindly bringing up more urban poor workers is more like the government's incentive to clear out the city area so that there will be less traffic jam, there will be less crime and other things. That's what we see is happening when in Beijing, China, slums, buildings are being teared down, people are prefer to move out of town simply because of their economic disadvantage. And also, even if we conceal to some of their principle to say, yes, there will be certain level of development given that the government is likely to invest. However, we think this kind of growth is limited to a certain time period. Why is that so? Just as I analyzed, when only the global urban poor people move into the areas, oftentimes they are unskilled worker. There are people who have little skill and who have limited ability to build up the entire thing and to generate new capital flow. That's the reason why when the rich people being left in the urban area who have already enjoyed enough space, given that they have a lot of population moved out of their city, they have less investment to expand their industry, to find more clean air in this rural area, to put money and investment into that. That's essentially the reason why in the long run, when you lose all the like political capital to support either the people in the poor people remain in the urban area, or the new poor that's that has settled down in the rural area, you lose like your obligation towards these group of people. I think that's against your initial will as well. But finally, let's look at what alternatives that we have under our side. We think when you naturally see more urban poor are suffering in their city area, it's more likely for them first to give direct aid towards these people by improving their living condition. For example, by improving their salary and by improving their like rights at work. So that's the answer that we have to a question that opponents have raised. How are they going to get out of this poverty trap? We think that's exactly when they were living in the familiar situation that they were in. They were having like this education for their kids, that they eventually will have the chance to move up and get new life. And second, and finally, about like why we think development is still going to happen under our side. We think due to the development needs, it's more likely for the government to employ a more realistic oriented way to attract more capital towards rural area that eventually develops. Very proud to oppose.
I thank second negative for their speech, and I invite third affirmative to conclude the substantive portion of the affirmative team's case.
Hello, am I audible? All right. Just give me a couple of seconds.
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. In a debate about what the government should do, it is simply not enough aside negative to just talk about why rural areas are not currently developed right now without analyzing the reason why they are that way, the reason why they're likely to improve on our side of the house, and why the state owes some sort of obligation. Their material centers around the fact that these places have deficiencies in access, unable to respond to our material on why that's likely to get better. But more so, they never give a justification for why we should allow the urban poor's lives to be prioritized over the lives of the rural poor, in as much as they say that rural poor will now be unable to move back. We don't see why that's necessarily a bad thing, particularly because this arrests the trend of unidirectional migration from rural areas to cities. But more so, we think we're also able to prove quite sufficiently, although this is not necessarily a burden, that the lives of these same urban poor are significantly better. A couple of responses to the last speech we just heard before I go into a number of questions today. So then they say that like it's hard to set up things like job training, like you can't set up new industries, etc. Like a couple of responses to this. Firstly, setting up these sorts of things requires people. In as much as setting up an industry requires shop floor workers, it requires people to man, like say, supply chains, etc. It requires media in terms of people knowing that these sorts of opportunities exist, in terms of attracting new sponsors, etc. Secondly, we say that given that they migrated, some of the skills would have been carried over. For instance, if you were an auto driver who was unable to get a job in an urban area, you are likely to transfer some of those skills in rural area, where it's likely to be less competitive job markets. You're able to utilize those skills. Therefore, these industries are set up quite effectively. But thirdly, notice that if you want a player to enter these areas, if you want like a company to provide job training, you require some sort of market to think for the company to think they can sustain themselves there. The fact that more people are migrating, and the fact that we recognize that the eye of the media is always on the way that these programs are effective, on what happens to these people once they migrate, we think at that point companies are aware that there is a market to sustain. Therefore, that's the way that we get change. Then they say that it's hard to acquire political capital now in urban areas because you have smaller numbers. 5 different responses to this. Firstly, we think political capital currently is ineffective. Like the fact that they live in slums, etc., means they already have incredibly limited access. But the kinds of access they have is incredibly tokenistic in terms of representation about what the average poor person wants in the eyes of the rich, in the eyes of influential politicians. We think that sort of narrative which stirs up sympathies like this. But secondly, we think that the kinds of people who are there to stir up political change through activism are unlikely to move out because they have a strong incentive to stay back. like the incentives to move is not so coercive that the people have a strong dedication in these areas will still move out. Thirdly, we say things like remittances. Once people go to these rural areas and are able to set up a life for themselves and are able to get some sort of employment, means that they are likely to help these people in the poor whom they left back in the first place. So we don't see why this split is likely to happen anyway, because we think the state can also incentivize movements of families, etc. Fourthly, we think your life improves in urban areas itself, because the fact that people are now moving out means there's less of a glut around things that you want in terms of access to transportation services, in terms of access to jobs, etc. Reduced competition means you're like each person in the urban poor gets a better chance of success. And finally, we say that there's lower congestion in slums, mean that there's fewer health problems, fewer issues of sanitation, mean that your life overall is better. Then they say, in response to our idea of like why why the state needs to incentivize this, there are certain things that ground people, things like your social network, things like the media, things like access to information and intergenerational benefits. Understand that for this to exist, they had to prove why there's a likelihood of these becoming better. However, we say that cities are already incredibly competitive and trend to get worse. We show you that in terms of them running out of resources, they're running out of sustainable plans for the future, etc. More so when they characterize that there is like some scale of like upliftment of yourself from poverty. It's unclear from them like the kinds of people who have access to this upliftment in the first place. We say the sorts of people who are seeing the trajectory of growth are unlikely to move towards rural areas in the first place. It's more about the masses of the rural poor who don't have that ability. Then, because understand that all their benefits which they want to localize in urban areas are never mechanized by them. It's unclear how the state has the affordability or even the incentive to have like say skill development programs when these sorts of things are heavily saturated up. Four things to talk about, right? The problems with cities and how, like, why those are untenable and why we need to move out. Secondly, why is this better when they move to a rural area? Thirdly, why do we need incentive creation for this sort of thing? And fourthly, why is the state justified in doing this? So, in terms of the problems with cities, right? All they tell you is that there's going to be some amount, like the state stop caring about the urban poor anymore. We think that's unlikely to be true. We already mechanized our political capital. It's still going to exist to a great degree. There's still going to be some amount of conversation. More so, we think like communication with, like about the efficiency of these policies still goes back to the government. The state is still aware about how to fix these things. More so, we think the signaling effect means that the state is aware that like there's like in both places, right? In cities where there's now a smaller congestion in areas like slums, and also in rural areas where there are now more people which need to be taken care of. It means that these ideas of urban concentration like healthcare, rent, etc., becoming more and more expensive are never quite tackled by them. And therefore, we think that these sorts of things are untenable. What they had to give you in this debate is some mechanism by which we are likely to expect better returns from people living in these cities. The fact that taxes are going higher, the fact that you don't really get facilities means that it's uncomparative. The only example they give us is someone who's unable to get a good internet connection when she moved to a rural area. We think like that person probably doesn't qualify as the urban poor in the first place, because these people have a severe lack of amenities, as we already characterized. Therefore, we believe problems with cities, even if some people have access to amenities, are worth the state considering in terms of an escape for these sorts of things. The second idea is on the outcomes when you move to rural areas. And here's where they have incredibly limited response. They say that there's currently lack of access to facilities like internet. But understand, the only way you remedy that is if, like, say, internet companies have an incentive to set up towers because they know how many people to cater to, right? It's unlikely that they'll do this if it's like scant people spread out in large areas with limited access to these sorts of facilities, because they don't see a model of sustainability. On our side, we mechanize why industries have a great incentive, why the state wants to encourage more people to move into these areas, where the media tries to show the sorts of development that rural areas are going through and that they require. Therefore, we think that development is likely to happen. They say that there's a feeling of sense of loss of leaving you behind. Unclear why this is likely to be the case. We already characterized the second half that you can move back if you really want to. You can send back remittances. You can move back. The state isn't stopping you from doing that. But even if you can't, and there are some pressures on you now because your life has become comfortable, it's unclear why that's a bad thing. We think in as much as the state is now arresting the decline of people from rural areas, now they are moving to urban areas by influencing some movement back. It's unclear why like having people who have now settled in rural areas is a morally wrong thing. Then we say that like when they say it costs money to develop, we say like it's not true that rural areas have nothing right now. We think we characterize how they have heavy industry, we characterize things like transportation, etc. They just have a lack of incentive, a lack of a market, and lack of a workforce. We do all of those things, supplemented with the way the media keeps the state accountable. We think all these things provide a comparatively greater access and a greater model of development. That's something they don't engage with. Thirdly, why do we need this, right? Understand that like in terms of existing propaganda, in terms of how you are locked in and you don't have the ability to move out in the first place, we think state sets these up for you. Secondly, we talk about the uncertainty, which is something that they don't really engage with, right? Even if there's some sort of like even if the kinds of people that they talk about who have some grounding to their hometown are unlikely to move out. It's more about those people who would definitely be better served in rural areas, who we need to create some incentive for. The state has to do this because like cities are going to run out of resources. At some point, cities are on a downward trend for something they don't address. But finally, why should the state do this? One, we talk about state having utilitarian ideas, which means that there's no reason the state should arbitrarily prioritize the urban poor and keep providing opportunities to them, in as much as the state should address the fact that its territorial sovereignty is getting violated and people are just concentrating resources, setting up a cycle where resources only go to one particular area. It's failing itself as a state. When the state on our side is able to achieve these utilitarian ends without compromising on the overall well-being of these sorts of urban poor, we think that's when we win this debate.
I thank third affirmative for their speech. I invite third negative to conclude the substantive portion of this debate.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay, great. So as the third speaker of the negative side, I would like to identify the three main clashes that we have about today. So first is whether this policy of government incentivize the urban poor to move to rural areas is good for the urban poor themselves. So the proposition mentioned to us that there will be more favorable conditions for the urban poor. They will have opportunities, the job market, and the houses are more affordable. But however, we can see that they are making a comparison between the job market. But the thing is, earning a job or having a job doesn't mean that your life is satisfactory and it's necessarily satisfactory. For example, if you find that your techniques or your own skills that doesn't fit into the industry that is established in the poor area, like they point out to us, like they want those to establish those factories, manufactories, or farmings. But however, as an urban poor, urban poor is a very complex union, and they are a complex group. It is not just like those immigrants from the rural areas become the urban poor. It is some urban poor are inherently poor, but they were born in a city and they are trapped because and they have share the same identity as the urban people. So probably they will have the family and all those connections in the urban areas. But however, if the government incentivizes those urban poor to move to the rural areas, it is very hard for them to move in. And why is that? It is very hard for them to integrate into the rural society. It is exactly because that rural society is quite different from the urban society. The societal structure, the relationships between people, and also all the infrastructure, they are all different from the urban areas. So it is exactly why there are also a lot of negative things for us to consider when the government is in the want of promoting for this kind of narrative that rural areas is better for the urban poor to live in. The next question is that why is our scenario more likely to happen? And they tell you that there will be a lot of infrastructure establishment about in rural areas, like there will be industry or there will be a well-rounded infrastructure. But however, we tell you that it is exactly because that rural areas is quite different from the urban areas. It is inherently like less capable of addressing new blood or addressing new capitals into these areas. Like if you want to build a whole industry in the rural areas, it will cost a lot of money and even more investment than the government wants to like post on the refinement of the urban areas. So it is far more unlikely for the government to build up a full infrastructure in rural areas, and especially that it functions automatically. So at this point, at this situation, if we just regardlessly incentivize those urban poor to move into rural areas, and we give them a quite beautiful scenario, we tell them that life is greatly improved, and you have a job, and your family will live happily forever. But however, when we are seeing the rural areas, it is far more likely that it cannot develop at its own. It cannot develop automatically because the industry structure is far more vulnerable than the urbans. So you may ask why at this time the government incentives to continuously support the rural areas development. Just as Jenna mentioned to you, that it is exactly because that when we are doing this policy of making all the urban pools to move into the rural areas, it is exactly what the government is urging these urban pools to give up all the political capitals they have earned during the centuries or during the years that they have lived in the urban areas. Like if a poor people live in a slum, they have finally have the chance to be noticed by the government, by the city council. And at this time, the government urges them or incentivizes them to move to the rural areas. And so all the pains and sufferings are just kicked out, and they are live happily ever after because the government make them promises. So at this time, the government will use this vacancy or this spaces for the development, for the to introducing new talents, like for the infrastructure, to reconstructing the city. So it is exactly how the polarization will happen. So the government think that the the poor urban poor has already done their duty, and they are supposed to move in the rural areas and live a happy life. So we don't have the incentives to care more about them. So it is exactly why the government will not continuously fund them or continuously help them, support them to in the long term. They would choose to invest a lot of money on their urban area development. That is exactly how this kind of scenario are going to happen. And last is why we have a greater impact. We believe that this policy could have alternatives which would directly aid those poor rural areas, and also it can have a greater function on them. And why is that? Because it is exactly that the government would choose to prioritize about how to use the foundation, how to use the investment. If they can directly aid those rural poor areas, like to fulfill their promises, fulfill their manifestos when they are making campaigns, then it's possible that the urban areas don't have to give up all the information flow or their personal connections that they establish in the city. So at this time, the best case is that the urban poor will be saved and their life will be improved. At the same time, they will not lose the unique benefits that is provided by the urban life. So we believe that compared with their scenario, which the urban poor are entirely moved into the rural areas where they cannot integrate in, they cannot fit in, and it's much harder for them to return to the urban areas to start a different life. We believe that if we can use the alternatives like a direct aid towards those poor rural urban pools, then it is far more better that we can solve their problems. And that's all. Thank you.
I thank the third negative for their speech, and I invite the negative reply.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me clearly?
Yep.
Thanks. So basically, three things in this debate. First, the nature of the incentive. Second, what will be the real help for the urban poor? And thirdly, what probably will be a better mechanism for the rural development to actually take place. First, on incentive, we think despite we can't say it's entirely wrong or implausible, but we could to some extent say it might be a little bit luring or a little bit unresponsible when after you set up those this policy because of the nature, like how the urban poor perceive this message. Because like naturally, as a government, in an effort for you to wish this policy would take place, it probably advocates for the good side. It's like probably through the very official newspaper that people get this information. They feel like imagine or it's even out of their own illusion that they look for the thing that's probably not suited for them. However, what will be really helpful for the urban poor? First, we think is improve the city life for this group of people. We have told you like how the cultural opportunity and social opportunities exclusively in the city that that has the like suits the best interest for the urban poor. Given that they've already chosen to stay in that, we've given you like tons of like examples. For example, education and social network you only get to establish in urban city, and also a possibility of like of the urban poor by giving them like the favoring policies such as workplace and housing subsidy, like we case we're seeing in various of rent tickets and compulsory education, these kind of things. They refuse to admit that they take away the potential political capital for all this possibility that we've mentioned to happen. But it is true, because when the government's saying that already you can choose to go for the rural to search for a good life, but you don't choose so then the responsibility is all on the urban poor, but not us. But finally, why do we think it's not a very good way for the rural area to develop in the first place? We think first, in an effort for you to have like thorough development and to have these equal chances as new cities, you need the ability for the rural system to renew themselves and to be sustainable. However, we've proven to you that this is not plausible under their preference because there were not basic requirements made, such as the education that is as good as what is in the city, the capital flood is not seen happening. But also, secondly, because they take away the urban rich's interest in looking and expanding new area, given that their own city has been cleaned off of these like bad environments, traffic, like work problem. We think that is the added point that the urban area lose the way that the old development, the potential development method they could have had by attracting more rich people trying in the urban city first, rather than first like employing these urban poor into the area. Based on all these things, we're very proud to oppose.
I thank the negative reply. I invite the affirmative reply to conclude round 2 of Australs.
Hello.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yes, you are.
Yeah, thank you, no problem. I'll start in 5 seconds. 3, 2. Opposition has reduced this debate to whether an urban area is better than a rural area, without ever talking about why urban poor and specific can access the facilities of the urban areas, or why exactly is this incentive structure going to be so poor, right? The only relevance to this debate came out at third negative when they talked about restructuring spaces, which we think you can't predict, but to the extent we do, we think we still win this debate. What are the particular clashes here when we deal with it? The first concern becomes there are worse facilities in rural areas, right? Firstly, we think it's just on the comparative. It's unlikely that they'll get access, the urban poor gets access to urban facilities, right? Those they probably live in ghettos where schools are underfunded, where they probably can't even go to these schools or get access to the healthcare facilities in the first place. No response. 2, we think we simply need people in the rural areas for incentive structures to come up to do this, right? There is when more people go to rural areas, more private players come into play and fix the particular intent connection of the people living there. 3, we're simply shifting money away from urban development to rural development, which means states have more money to actually fund these urban areas, which means better facilities inevitably come up. Lastly, we simply think rural areas aren't that bad, right? They do have good schools, do have decent healthcare facilities, and more importantly, they have affordable housing, a lot of land space, which these people can use for their essentials to live, right? 2, the second clash is about whether it's worse for urban poor in terms of political will, right? 3 responses. A, we simply think that these people don't vote in the majority of cases, they usually disillusioned by the government. This was clarified during the second and third speech, right? Two, we simply think that whatever catering happens in terms of political will caters towards the rich. Notice there the major stakeholder that was clear from our first speech. Three, which as the third affirmative pointed out, the simple people who drive for political will, like activists, inevitably end up staying because it's a cause dear to their heart. We think that for the most part, political will is preserved, which means this choice won't necessarily affect it. Then the other, how it's worse for the urban poor, becomes about education and jobs, which we think we clearly win, right? Firstly, we think there's a limit to how cities can grow because they cater to only a couple sectors which are in manufacturing sectors, and they have a limited size, and they have a limit to political catering. Two, within the rural areas have these industries which can cater to these neighborhoods, right? They have incentives to develop. They already exist. We just need incentives to develop them and make it more efficient for economic productivity. Three, we simply think it's easier to get these jobs in our house because there's a lack of competition based in these rural areas. And it's more like a manufacturing, like productivity jobs, which are easier, like relatively easy to scale to, right? Four, we think that it's just a better standard of living because now we can actually access education, have a better, access to education, have affordable housing, have more money on your hands simply because you're going to waste it on living in again, right? Lastly, we simply think those with a strong sense of identity will simply stay back in that particular place. Which means their only harm comes when they somehow try to prove that it's so coerced due to political propaganda, which we think they dropped at the end of the speeches because it was rebutted at second affirmative, right? What exactly did it say in combat coercion? We simply think one, awareness is made part of this model. We give them information on what this area is realistically going to look like. Two, media incentive to cover like unbearable, unrealistic portrayals of this particular rural area, which means people get more information about what it's going to look like on our side of the house. Three, like we agree, rural areas aren't Disneyland, right? But comparatively, they're so much better off than the ghettos or slums these people are forced to live in, and they're forced to be stuck in because of a poverty trap they never really wanted to be in first, right? We think this means our impacts and our obligations still remain unchallenged because they really ended up proving the relevance in this debate, which means that obligations and our impacts that derive from that still stand. What are they? A, we think that for those with strong sense of identity to the particular city, we think we proved here they're not coerced and political will doesn't go on. These development for them might still happen to some extent. Right? Two, and these are our two obligations. We think one, it's a counterbalance to the already existing one-side migrations away from rural areas to the cities, which entrenches that poverty trap. We are breaking that really well. Three, we think that because you're a state and you claim territorial sovereignty over everything, you need to create equitable development, which really happens on our side of the house. There's incentives for players to come into the market. Extremely proud to propose.
I thank the affirmative reply for their speech, and I thank everyone for their speeches. I invite everyone to cross the floor and shake hands.